Okay, so we may have a few more people arriving, but I'll just kind of start just by reminding everyone that this is part of an ongoing series of talks that we're having pretty much every month, where we're inviting different authors who all have chapters in our book, the Palgrave Handbook of Screenwriting, which Paolo is demonstrating. Last month we had Kristen Thompson talking about act structure. And so this month we have Stephen Price, who is Emeritus Professor at Bangor University, but we're also very fortunate to have him as a screenwriting tutor at Greenwich, University of Greenwich. And Stephen is the author of several books, including the screenplay, authorship theory and criticism, and history of the screenplay. And he really is one of the founding scholars of screenwriting studies, if you like. So we're really delighted to have him talking with us today. And his chapter in the Palgrave Handbook of Screenwriting Studies is entitled Historiographies of Screenwriting. So I'm going to talk to him, as I said, a little bit about that research and how it kind of fits into his wider research. And then we'll open up for questions. So, Stephen, welcome. I wonder, would you begin by just telling us a little bit about your chapter for those who haven't read it, and I suppose the key points that you wanted to articulate?
Yeah, I guess to some extent it was condensing some of the things that I put into that history of the screenplay book that you mentioned. But I suppose to the extent that I was trying to present an argument, I was coming from a position that a lot of people will know from the classical Hollywood cinema book that Kristen Thompson was involved in, but particularly on the screenwriting front, Janet Steiger, and arguing that significant changes in screenplay form throughout history have tended to come about as a result of sort of industrial changes. And I know that some people don't entirely agree with that, because they sometimes argue that rather diminishes the agency of the individual writer. So I was quite interested in trying to, on the one hand, map out somewhat along the lines that the classical Hollywood cinema did, at least up until the 1930s, map out the significant changes in screenplay form, but also extend that beyond the point at which that book stops, and look at changes that happened thereafter, of which there are several. Second key thing that I wanted to flag up in the book and about the book is that there is a bit of a problem, which is that if you're monolingual, as I am, you're heavily dependent on what other people are doing, working on non-English language industries, and flagging up that there's really been quite a paucity of research in some of those areas. So I don't know much about Japanese screenwriting. I don't know much about Indian screenwriting. Even Italian screenwriting. I was honored to be invited to a conference at Bologna in 2 years ago, which was the first conference, I understand, on Italian screenwriting in Italy. So there are huge gaps in the field. And so what I ended up with was a slightly Hollywood-centric book with what reference I could plausibly make to other industries to try and give more of a global picture. But I was trying to flag up in that chapter just how many gaps there are and what the opportunities are. And I think the handbook goes some way towards trying to redress that balance. And I'm sure that'll be one direction that screenwriting research goes in the future. The third thing that I would flag up is this question of trying to relate an individual case study to wider historical concerns. And I do think this has been a little bit of a problem in aspects of the field, that you tend to get a sort of fragmentation of the field into rather piecemeal individual case studies of a particular film or a particular script that the researcher is interested in, but how do we join the dots on that and connect it to broader issues within screenwriting research? And I tried to do that in the last part of the chapter by drawing attention to one script that I thought fitted quite well into that ambition of meshing the individual analysis of an individual project with broader changes in screenwriting history.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that particular example?
I went to the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas in 2018, and I had a month's, like a lot of people get, you get a kind of month's grant, as it were, scholarship to study there. And I was researching David Mamet, who many years ago was the subject of my PhD research, and has become a somewhat problematic figure for me personally because his politics have gone in a direction that I don't particularly find conducive. But nevertheless, I think that's actually started to overshadow his achievements. Anyway, so I went to Austin and basically became a human photocopier for a month because you can't actually photocopy the script. So I was standing there with the camera doing this for a month and took 20,000 photographs. So some of that is still to be looked at. But what I thought might be interesting for that chapter was to look at Mamet's first produced screenplay, which is for The Postman Always Rings Twice, a film directed by Bob Rafelson. And Mamet had long acknowledged that, well, Rafelson taught me everything. I didn't know about screenwriting, and Rafelson told me all about it. And the archive does rather support that. So you get Mamet writing in his copy of the James M. Cain novel, tell it with pictures, tell the story with pictures, which we all think, of course that's sweet. But, I think one of the interesting things is there were very few guidelines for what a writer might do at that time, short of being told by a director. I think there's something slightly similar with Joseph Losey and Harold Pinter, actually, going back here. But the interesting thing is that was in 1979. And that is also the year that Sid Field's book comes out. I found that interesting. Another thing I found interesting was to follow up on something that Janet Steiger had presented. I think it was in Copenhagen, or Helsinki. It was in one of the early Screenwriting Network conferences, where she showed an enormous chart that Mamet had done in plotting out another film called Homicide. And it was very clear that he was simply working out a template for himself completely based on Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which of course then greatly influenced Christopher Vogler in his book. So I was interested in the fact that at this moment, 1979, you had arguably a guy who's going to become the most important screenwriter in the next decade in American movies, being taught A, by Bob Rafelson, B, kind of self-teaching himself through Aristotelian first principles that he'd applied when he was making his career as a playwright, and C, through a little later on, through working his own way through Joseph Campbell. So you've got these figures that become very significant once manuals start to take over from 1979 onwards, that Mamet had somehow already kind of absorbed their principles and was working it through for himself. There's absolutely no evidence that Mamet read any manuals, but he's working this all through for himself. So I find that very interesting. And then if you look at the archive, I mean, Klaus knows a lot about this as well. If you look at a lot of these projects for which we've only got surviving script materials, some of those script materials often include conference notes. And you've got conference notes where Rafelson is directly intervening and basically saying to Mamet, do it like this and so on. Or certainly giving him good advice and working out the story with him. But Rafelson gets no credit on the screenplay. It's a Mamet screenplay. So there were a number of things about that project that were exposing to me things that were happening in the production context that you wouldn't know if you'd simply looked at the screenplay and the film. And of course, Raffleson was also one of those directors who was going to start to lose his prominence somewhat at the end of the 70s. That kind of new Hollywood generation passed away, as it were, from such prominence as a result of a number of projects doing very badly financially. So you've got this post-classical Hollywood era. You've got the beginning of this era that's going to be dominated by screenwriting manuals. And it just so happens that the work that Mamet was doing for himself and with Raffleson on that film shows that this is a kind of turning point in screenwriting history, that someone is going to start to consciously apply models for himself, but without drawing on the screenwriting manuals that are then going to popularize those models for the non-professional, as it were. So, and again, I mean, I don't want to bore people, but if you just look at the number of script iterations and the kind of work that's being done on it, you can see a number of significant differences between the scripts that Mamet was finally producing and the one that I had seen when I was a PhD student that I thought was the screenplay of The Postman Always Rings Twice. And so, none of us are that naive anymore, but way back then I thought, oh, that is the screenplay for this film.
And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about, I suppose, how to approach that archival research, like which can be quite difficult. And I mean, what are the barriers, and what are your kind of, with your experience, what have you found to be kind of the ways to overcome those barriers? What are your tips, if you like, for successful archival research, and what are the pitfalls? How can you sort of get to what you're looking for and kind of put that story together? It would be really interesting to hear a bit more about like your techniques for that.
Well, that's a great question, actually, because when I started doing this in about 2001, where I was in an English department, but Mamet, Pinter, Stoppard, a lot of the people I was interested in were writing screenplays. And no one was writing about the screenplays, they're only writing about the plays. And I was interested, well, why is that? So I got a grant in 2003 to go to the States for a couple of months. And I really didn't know what I was looking at. It was ages before I would kind of work out, okay, this particular text type functioned at this particular stage in a pre-production process and so on. So it was years before I felt anything other than totally bewildered by the kind of question that you've just asked me. It's another very good question, because actually the Mamet archive is in sort of two parts. One is the script materials. And I thought that's what I was interested in. And basically, because I was just sitting there photographed, that's what I did, without being fully aware of the significance of a separate archive, which was more his kind of personal correspondence and business correspondence and so on. And from the little bits that I looked at too late in the day, I realized that actually, if you wanted to understand exactly what's going on with different script iterations and so on, you want to know more about the financial model that Mamet himself was following in producing these scripts. Was he writing them for himself? Was he writing them on commission? And so on, so that you can sort of split that archive into two types. One is where he's doing an adaptation. Again, you look at the novel, you look at the screenplay, you look at the film, and that's your entire research project. That's what I used to think. Clearly, it's more complicated than that. But there are others that are self-generated, like this homicide film, where he ends up producing this huge template for himself based on Joseph Campbell. So I think you need to know more about the production context of the film that you're analyzing before you can fully grasp the significance of the different text types that you're presented with. But again, Klaus has done more on this than I have. It's really fascinating. You can also visit an archive that's preserved the surrounding documents, the documents detailing story conferences and so on, and other types of collaboration, because otherwise you can have this sort of romanticized model of the screenwriter working by themselves and producing all this work, whereas in fact every iteration is an outcome of conferences involving other people. So I don't have a great answer to your question, but your question flags up some of the reasons why it took me a very long time to actually turn some of this research into gold.
Well, maybe we can come back to that some more and you know, talk about some more kinds of you know, approaches and potential barriers and so on, and maybe also that will come up in I suppose the last thing that I maybe ask you to talk about before we open out for more people to come in. But just around, I mean, obviously, one, as you mentioned in at the beginning, and is very much in your chapter, you're talking about the sort of incredible potential for more archival research and more historiographies and, you know, much more research in this area, despite the difficulties. But I wonder, I mean, how do you see the future open out? Is it going to become easier? Is digitization going to make this kind of research easier? Because it's sort of interesting that we've been thinking it will for, I don't know, maybe 20 years at least. And so far, it seems to not, doesn't seem to be a lot of digitization that's actually happened, certainly in this area of screenwriting, would you say? So I'd just be interested to know, yeah, what do you see as the kind of future possibilities and potential kind of new opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, you would have thought, as you've just said, that digitization would enable you, A, to get remote access to far more material than we currently do, and B, that translation software would make it possible, for example, for me to have done a bit more, at least on, say, Italian cinema than I was able to do. I suspect, but I don't know, that one of the reasons why this hasn't happened to the extent that we might have hoped is that people are or companies are depositing archives with their archives in particular institutions on the understanding that this is material to be looked at in person. I know this is the case. This is why I couldn't ask the Harry Ransom Centre to photocopy.
Right.
I had to be physically present. That was also the case at the Margaret Herrick Library in LA. I don't know what the situation at Madison is with the Warner's archive, but I suspect that it is simply a condition of the donation or sale that this is not simply to be digitized and made remotely accessible to anyone. I think that's the number one reason. A second reason that I probably flagged up more in the chapter is simply, I don't know how many people are actually sufficiently fascinated by screenwriting research to be doing that work in their countries and unearthing new material. But you know, I photocopied 20,000 pages of the Mammoth Archive. Took a photo of 20,000 pages. That took me a month. That's one writer. That was a fraction of that archive. So you need to be able to negotiate between what's new that hasn't been looked at in this archive that was interesting to me personally, but secondly, what's the significance of that if I'm trying to write a piece of research that's of interest to people who are not just interested in this particular writer or film that I'm writing about. And I suspect there just aren't a vast number of people sufficiently fascinated by this, even though I say screenwriting research is an open goal. I remember saying to a colleague of mine, because I say it took me a long time to work out what I was doing, and that this was holding me up, and this isn't great in a kind of publish or perish environment. But in the end, I kind of worked out more or less what I was doing. And but I remember talking to another colleague, and I said, the way to get your research career going is to become an expert in a field that nobody else is an expert in. You can be. And she, oh, great, thanks, because she was working on romantic poetry. You know what I mean? So it is an open goal for people. It really is, but you have to have a sufficient number of people who are interested in it.
And there are the access difficulties of actually getting to the archives.
You've got to get those grants and be prepared for the fact that when you get out there, you might be looking at something other than what you assumed you would be looking at. But that's, again, a great thing. Those archives, they just throw up fascinating insights into micro projects and bigger projects that you couldn't possibly know about if you weren't there on the ground looking at that archive.
So, maybe there are some other people who are sufficiently fascinated in archives on this call. It's quite likely. So I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Stephen. It reminds me of my last time before the pandemics in the archives, and what I realized at the end of the pandemic, libraries and archives, they started to digitalize and scan some scripts for me, but not too much, of course. But it was the first time that they said, yes, okay, we can scan you the whole script and send it to you. Because before that, you are only allowed to get into the holy grail at the Herrick library with a pencil or with your, and nothing else. And well, one of the reasons why it's not more digitized is, of course, money and personnel that they need, and it's copyright. The archives don't have the copyright, and they don't even know who the copyright of the screenplays are actually belong to. And but in the preparation for my archival trip, I went through biographies of directors and studies of not screenwriters, but everything around. And I realized that there were some scholars or other writers that they had already had a look at the various versions of screenplays. They tell you the story from the idea to the finished film, but they don't have the gaze, the look, the interest, and the questions that we have. And so we have to look at it again with our perspective. So there are people who were and are still interested in screenplays, but for different reasons than we are.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Stemple would be an example of someone who looked at very, very early screenplays, but that formed only a fraction of what was in his book, and he was more interested in the biographies and so on of individual screenwriters. So you have fragmentary things like that. You have Janet Steiger's contribution to classical Hollywood cinema, but it's based on what's in the Warner Brothers archive. It's a very persuasive argument, but the argument was that a particular style of script that's rather close to the master scene script had been agreed in the 30s, which is to some extent true. But when I looked at the MGM archive in a different place in the Herrick, the form was different, not drastically different, but it was different. So this is a great opportunity for screenwriting research. You can know a certain amount from what other people have done, but when you're doing your own research, you will modify. You need to be in light of what other people have done. So I knew to look at certain things that Tom Stemple looked at. I mean, that was a great. Sorry, go on.
They told me which material is where. Yeah? Without the appendix of Thomas Schatz's book, The Genius of the System, I would never have started to find the material. Yeah. But which screenplays are in which archives and so on. Yeah, there is also a lot of screenwriting studies in biographies of directors. They looked at the very different versions, but they are just telling stories and they're not analyzing it, they're not contextualizing it.
Mm.
They don't think
Very
about the
interesting.
development of the master scene script.
But just very interesting, just from what you're saying about knowing where to look. So if you go to one of the LA archives, they have kind of joined all the dots. So there's a dozen archives in LA, but they are joined up. So when you research a certain screenwriter or a certain film, you can see which institutions in the LA region hold all that material. And I can see Adam Gantz with his hand up because he proposed to me that we do something similar in London. You know, because if you want to research a certain actor or something, that the available materials might be spattered over several different archives. So that material needs to be done as well, because other than in LA, I'm not sure of other places that have done that.
So Adam, did you want to come in on that? And then Hugo, did you have a question? Yeah, okay. So
yeah, if possible, because it seems to me that, you know, as Klaus said, you know, you need advice for what's in the archive, but also the people in the archive don't always know what's in the archive, and they're not always thinking from a researcher's point of view, or what the evidence might be. I've also looked through those Mamet papers because of looking at De Niro and thinking, oh, you know, maybe there's some correspondence between De Niro and Mamet. And I went through it excitedly, ruffling through it, and it said, finally pulled out the, you know, M in the correspondence, N, and it said, to Dave and family, happy holidays, Bob and family. Which kind of, and at the same time, that is evidence, because it's evidence of the nature of their relationship, which was different from Mamet's or De Niro's relationship with other collaborators. It was not, you know, it was not intense, let's say, or maybe it was so intense that Mamet didn't want to, you know, but two people who archived their correspondence to a huge amount did not have any correspondence between them archived. That is actually relevant. Also, you know, and it seems to me that I can remember when we were organizing the London conference, going to the inspired by the Madison conference, going to the British Library and saying, can we also have a guide round your screenplay collection? And they said, we haven't got a screenplay collection. And we said, but you've got the Alec Guinness archive, you've got the Harold Pinter archive, and we listed the screenwriters who they had, and ultimately they not only showed us around the archive, but found an Oscar-winning writer who they had in their archive to talk about it. And there are screenplays can exist in all sorts of places, you know, in adaptations of novels, in agents' archives, in actors' archives, in directors' archives. I mean, somebody has pointed out, but sadly the BBC archive is in such a poor state that there is, you know, there are in the BBC archive, there are screenplays written by probably every single British writer of note, and quite a lot not of, like, from the 20th and 21st century, and lots of other ones too, but there's no way necessarily of accessing them because, you know, it's open 1.5 days every other Tuesday or whatever it is, you know. But it does seem that actually the ways in which screenwriting studies has started to piece together all of these different opportunities mean that not only are there many more archives than we think, and it's perhaps in film towns above all that they're archived as, you know, as important film documents, but they will exist in other places as well. Bodleian's got a great screenplay collection by accident, I think. But you might also start by poking around in the archive of people who dealt with screenplays. You will find all sorts of fragments, discussions, debates. You know, the Robert Donat archive, for example, has that fantastic, you know, Donat's preparations for, you know, his emotion chart for a screenplay, so you can start to see quite early on how an actor is working in the 1930s, you know, with a screen text. And it seems that it's really worth almost whatever your interest is, and there are so many phenomenal interests in the book. You know, almost everyone could be supported by, you know, thinking about what archive to look at. And remember, you know, evidence of absence is not necessarily absence of evidence. If people are not archiving their screenplays, or that's also tells you something about how they think about their work, for example.
And just for the purposes of excitement, can I just add to what you were saying about De Niro and Mamet, that there is a letter from De Niro to somebody, and it's not directed to Mamet, in his archive, asking for a rewrite on a film called Ronin. And he wasn't happy with the dialogue or something like that, asking for a polish. That finds its way to Mamet, and Mamet completely rewrites the entire script. Other than that, he keeps the car chases. And the original script, the pre-Mamet script, is in the De Niro archive. So if I hadn't looked in the De Niro archive, I wouldn't know what it was that Mamet was working from. But if we hadn't had that letter in the De Niro archive, we wouldn't know that it was at De Niro's request that Mamet comes on board and rewrites that. So yeah, joining up dots, and there are so many millions of dots out there. We don't even know what dots we need to look for.
That's an interesting case because, of course, when you talk about correspondence, usually very often, the archive of the correspondence from one of the two people involved in the correspondence is in one place, and then the responses to those is another archive. So you have to basically combine them together if you want to see the full picture. Yeah. I think that Hugo had
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you all for making this podcast possible, because it's truly fantastic. Professor Stephen Price, in the section on microhistories, you say, and let me read it briefly, we should be wary of finding ourselves in a hermeneutic circle whereby the individual script is comprehensible only in relation to the industrial structure, but that structure is validated only with reference to individual scripts. So I wonder, what do you recommend, to new screenwriter researchers in terms of, for example, methodology, to avoid falling into that hermeneutic circle you mentioned?
I think it's probably the first bit of advice I give everybody is work from the script outwards to some extent. So I think there's a danger of thinking, I know this about this film industry, therefore this script fits in there. In other words, that kind of deductive process, I know what the principles are, therefore this is where this script fits within those principles. I think that's usually a mistake, because in most endeavors, and certainly in any kind of film production, it's a lot messier, to use a word Rodman used, a lot messier than those models make you think. But looking at it from the other point of view, as I mentioned before, we're all interested in certain scripts, certain films, certain writers, and so on and so forth. But we kind of we don't want our writing to be of interest only to people who are interested in that particular project that I'm interested in, particularly in a field like this, where we really still are. Really, we should be at the early stages of where we might hope to get to, I think. We do need to try and connect what we're looking at to some kind of a broader structure. So, I mean, just to give another example, I don't think I did mention this in that book, but I looked at some scripts that Tom Stoppard did for Parade's End, which is a BBC series. And he was doing all kinds of things in those scripts that you just wouldn't do. I mean, no way. But he can get away with that because of his authorial status, as it were. So, yeah, we've got Tom Stoppard to write this. We won't contradict the form in which he submitted those scripts. But I wouldn't be able to infer anything broader about the industry that he's writing within as a result of that, other than to say significant deviation from those norms tends to be a sign of authorial status. Some people can get away with this. Whereas if you're looking at manuals, it seems to me to be very, very prescriptive often. They're written for people who don't have that status. They're written for outsiders who are trying to break in, and that can therefore give the impression that there are all these inviolable rules you have to follow. And maybe you do if you're trying to break in, but as soon as someone is in there, you see them breaking those rules a bit. So I think, as I say, my advice to anyone would be, don't just assume that whatever you're looking at is simply following the broader principles that you're aware of, but try and work from the script outwards and see anything that's striking me as unusual, what might be occasioning this. And it's often a sign of status, but not always.
I was just here listening to you speak there, Stephen, and thinking about, if I may ask a question about the sort of new Hollywood that you were talking about earlier, and this particular period, and picking up on that earlier point. But I was interested in your book. You talked the history of the screenplay. You make some interesting points about how there seems to be in the sort of late 60s, that new Hollywood era, more opportunities for screenwriters to include sort of literary flourishes and visual sort of concepts and things like that. And I suppose on one hand, I just wondered, in terms of your return to Mamet now and looking at that sort of late 70s, and I'd always imagined him being someone who might do that sort of thing, but it sounded like he was kind of more sort of following the sort of manual route. And are you finding that sort of looking at his work, that kind of those literary flourishes and that sort of thing is kind of not so much there in Mamet's work in the sort of later 70s? But I suppose more generally as well, do you see your work as well as kind of contributing to sort of screenwriting historiographies, but rethinking this kind of much mythologized period of film history, and whether the sort of these sort of screenwriting historiographies can kind of go beyond the screenwrite and contribute to the sort of histories of the period that seem to so often focus on directors and, you know, that certain sort of familiar figures. It was really interesting to hear what you said about Bob Raffleson as well, because from what some of those mythic books about the New Hollywood often talk about, he's often claiming screenwriting credit, certainly with people like Carol Eastman, who writes Five Easy Pieces, and he seems to sort of wedge himself on there, unfairly so from a lot of accounts. So it was very interesting to hear that he seems to not be doing that with Mamet in the 70s. Yeah.
Well, I'll just start with the final point on Raffleson, just to clarify. It's not that Raffleson is writing text that finds its way into the screenplays. It's that Raffleson is acting as a kind of mentor to this, you know, celebrated playwright, but novice screenwriter who's happy to work with him. And so, I mean, you know, going back to something I did a long time ago, Hitchcock is another example. Hitchcock would always be accused of trying to take all kinds of credit for work that actually other collaborators had done. But actually, if you look at the Hitchcock archives, Hitchcock is enormously involved in shaping the screenplays for all of his films. But I think there may be one early film where he takes one credit. I may be wrong about that. But none of the others. But those screenplays were really shaped by Hitchcock working with a screenwriter in a number of conferences, and Hitchcock was very much the dominant voice there, but he would never take credit for it. So I think that's one thing that archival research can do. I think it can help you to go beyond the anecdotal, as it were. As far as the New Hollywood's concerned, I mean, it does seem interesting to me that it's at the end of the 70s that Sid Field book comes out, just as that New Hollywood is starting to collapse. And I mean, that this is too big a point and probably unsustainable. But I do wonder if there's almost a bit of a democratization of screenwriting once those idols have fallen, and the manuals are, much as with the scenario fever of the 1920s, the manuals are catering for people who legitimately think, actually, you know, I can make a way in this business that wouldn't have been open to me before. It seemed more like a closed shop. But I don't know. That's probably too broad a point. As far as literary embellishment is concerned, actually, one of the things that Mamet prides himself on is a very spare style, but it's very, very obviously him. You listen to, in particular, listen to a film script by Mamet. He's not very good at being anyone other than Mamet, I would say. And you can notice that, even though it's a very spare kind of style. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but
No, absolutely, it's interesting. So he keeps a sort of a authorship or an identity whilst maintaining a sort of more spare style.
yeah, he refused to be rewritten. He wrote a play that someone adapted into a film, and he was furious about this. And basically resolved, I will not be rewritten, which is almost an impossible position to maintain. But the way he did that was to write and direct his own scripts, and other than that, he was a writer for hire and could be rewritten. But yeah, it's a familiar problem for screenwriters coming from many different directions, I think.
No, just interesting, that last bit. Did Mamet ever make a reflection that he didn't want to be rewritten whilst himself rewriting other works? Did he ever do that? Do you know that, Stephen? If he had any self-reflection on him being hired to rewrite, but refusing himself to be rewritten?
I'm not aware of him writing it down in those terms, but
no, that's right.
It's well documented that he was.
Yeah.
The turning point seems to be in The Untouchables, when I can't remember if it's the director or the producer, but they were trying to get some things. They were trying to get him to do rewrites when he was trying to get his own film House of Games off the ground, and he was furious at being asked to rewrite himself. So again, when I talk about status, I think he was keen to get for himself the status at which he would simply not be rewritten. The only writer that I know had a contract to this effect, though, was Pinter. Pinter had, as it were, final cut on the script and couldn't be rewritten without his permission. But that's why I was saying, if I'd spent more time in this other half of the Mamet archive, talking about the kind of business arrangements and financial arrangements, contractual arrangements, I might have been able to answer that question. And retrospectively, I wish I'd kind of spent half the time in one half of the archive and the other half in the other, because what I've got are a lot of scripts, but I don't have a lot of answers to the kind of question that you just asked.
So there's quite a few notes in the chat as well. I'm sure everyone's seen, with different links to resources. Yeah, Adam, did you want to say one final thing?
Yeah, following on from that, like, Stephen, which archive would you want to look at next? Is there a, you've looked at Mamet, you've done work on Pinter, you've kind of done some work on De Niro, I know, but what is there another way of looking at is there a writer that you'd like to look at, or a relationship that you'd like to explore archivally, and what would you hope to discover?
The one that's always interested me, but I just didn't have time to look at it, was the Stoppard archive, which is also in the Harry Ransom, because Stoppard has this reputation of being a script doctor. So there are scripts that we know he wrote. But very often, again, my knowledge on this is patchy. Very often, I think you will be, as it were, contractually obliged not to reveal that you did doctoring. But the archive presumably would reveal that he did doctoring. And I think this is one whole area in screenwriting research, and again, please tell me stuff that I don't know. this is one whole, everybody's heard of script doctors. Everybody's looked at scripts, or lots of us looked at scripts that have been rewritten under certain circumstances. But I haven't specifically looked at the archive of someone who had a reputation as a script doctor to see what they did and what survived into the cut of the film. And Stoppard would be a really interesting one on that. Whereas Mamet, I think, was basically off. You kind of know which ones he rewrote. That's almost a matter of public record, and you know which novels he adapted and so on and so forth. But Stoppard, to me, has always been a little bit more of a mysterious figure. But I haven't read the recent biographies on him, so people might well have already done research on that. But just seeing what a script doctor does, and again, you've got to then join up the two parts of the archive. You've got to look at the contractual arrangements and see what are you being asked to do. And are you being made any promises to what's going to be done with your work? So that would be one I'd be really interested in. But I suspect there are people out in this chat who know more about these kind of things than I do. But this is one of the things about archival research. You can answer questions that until you've gone and had a proper look are just a matter of speculation and anecdote.
I think there are a couple of script doctors on the call, actually, but they may not.
How much do they pay you, Adam?
Not me.
Okay. Well, I think if there's no other burning questions, we'll round up now. It's nearly 6, so in the UK. But thanks again, everyone, for coming. Paolo, do you want to announce who we have next and when the next session will be?
Yes, episode 3 will be on Tuesday, the 11th of March, so 1 month from now. It's going to start a little later because our guest will be joining us from California, and it will be Catherine Fisk, who has written a chapter for us in the handbook about the unionization of writers, both for the stage and for the screen. So Catherine Fisk, Tuesday, the 11th of March.